A fire in the mansion revealed that the pregnant maid was more important to the millionaire than he thought. The positive pregnancy test trembled in Emma Sullivan's hands as she sat on the floor of the luxurious bathroom in the Hayes mansion. Silent tears streamed down her face, mixing with the cleaning products she had just used. It was 6 in the morning, and she needed to pull herself together before the other employees arrived, especially before Alexander Hayes came down for his breakfast at 7. Emma put the test away in the pocket of her uniform and took a deep breath, looking at her reflection in the crystal mirror. Her green eyes were slightly puffy, but nothing that a quick rinse with cold water couldn't solve. Her brown hair, always tied up in an impeccable bun, showed a few unruly strands that she quickly fixed. Pregnancy was not in her plans, let alone a solo pregnancy. The Hayes Mansion was an imposing Victorian building in Newport, Rhode Island, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Emma had been working there for 3 years, during which time she had become the house's most trusted employee. Alexander Hayes, known for his demanding and methodical personality, rarely showed satisfaction with anything, but with Emma, it was different. She knew every detail of his preferences, every little particularity that made the gears of that house work perfectly. Miss Sullivan, Alexander's deep voice echoed down the hallway, making Emma jump. She quickly put away the cleaning products and straightened her uniform. "Yes, Mr. Hayes," she replied, maintaining the professional composure that always characterized her. Alexander appeared at the bathroom door, already impeccably dressed in his navy blue Italian suit. His gray eyes analyzed her for a moment longer than usual, as if he could tell that something was different. "I need you to organize my schedule for the meeting with the Japanese investors." And he paused, frowning slightly. "Are you all right? You look pale." Emma felt her heart race. "I'm fine, sir. Just a slight morning sickness, nothing to worry about." Alexander nodded, not entirely convinced. "Have some tea? I can't have my best employees sick." There was a softness in his voice that few knew, a gentleness that he reserved exclusively for her, although they both pretended not to notice. The following weeks became an elaborate game of hide and seek. Emma disguised her morning sickness, hid the subtle changes in her body under her baggy uniform, and avoided prolonged encounters with Alexander. But fate had other plans for that fall morning. The smell of smoke was the first warning. Emma was organizing the library when she noticed dark smoke coming from under the door. The alarm system then went off deafeningly. Her first instinct was to run outside, but she remembered that Alexander was in his office on the 3rd floor, probably absorbed in his endless spreadsheets and phone calls. Without a second thought, Emma ran up the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest. The smoke grew thicker with each step. "Mr. Hayes," she shouted, coughing. The heat was intense, and the flames were already licking the walls of the corridor. Alexander came out of the office, disoriented, surprised by her presence. "Emma, what are you doing here? Leave immediately." "Not without you," she insisted, taking his hand and leading him towards the emergency staircase. But a deafening crash stopped them. Part of the ceiling collapsed, blocking the way. It was at that moment that Emma felt dizzy, the world spinning around her. The smoke, the stress, the pregnancy, everything conspired to make her legs weak. Alexander caught her before she fell, his strong arms wrapping around her protectively. "Emma," his voice was full of concern. "Hang on." He lifted her into his arms, desperately searching for an escape route. The only possible way out was to the office balcony. Alexander didn't hesitate with Emma in his arms. He crossed the burning office and reached the balcony. The fire department had already arrived, positioning a ladder for them. During the perilous descent, Emma partially regained consciousness, clinging to Alexander. "The baby," she muttered without realizing it. Alexander froze for a second, but kept his focus on getting them out safely. When they finally reached the ground, Emma was immediately attended to by paramedics. Alexander didn't leave her side, his eyes revealing a mixture of concern and confusion. At the hospital, Emma awoke to find Alexander sitting beside her bed, his expensive suit stained with soot, his usually perfect hair mussed. Their gazes met, and the silence between them was laden with unasked questions. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Emma looked away, tears threatening to fall. I was going to lose my job. I couldn't risk it, not now." "Lose your job?" Alexander looked genuinely surprised. "Emma, you risked your life and your babies to save me." How could you think I'd fire you? The silence that followed was interrupted by the doctor's entrance, confirming that both Emma and the baby were fine, only slightly affected by smoke inhalation. Alexander listened attentively to every medical recommendation as if he were memorizing an important business presentation. When they were alone again, Alexander approached the bed, his eyes revealing a vulnerability that Emma had never seen before. "We need to talk," he said softly, "about many things. But first you need to understand that your place in the Hayes mansion and in my life is more important than you realize." Emma felt her heart race, not from the smoke or the fear, but from the way Alexander looked at her, as if for the first time he was really seeing her. The hospital room fell into a deep silence after Alexander's statement. Emma adjusted herself on the hospital bed, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of the sheet as she tried to process his words. The rhythmic sound of the heart monitor was the only noise that filled the room. "Mr. Hayes," she began, but Alexander gently interrupted her. "Alexander," he corrected, "after today, I think we can dispense with the formalities." Emma. Soot still stained his face in places, and his normally impeccable shirt was crumpled and scorched. Still, there was a dignity in his posture that not even the chaos of the fire had managed to shake. "The doctor says you need rest," he continued, "so I've arranged a private suite here at the hospital. And don't worry about the mansion. The fire was brought under control in time, and the damage was mainly restricted to the third floor." Emma nodded, feeling a twinge of guilt. "I'm sorry about your office." "Papers could be replaced," Alexander replied firmly. "Not lies." His eyes fixed on Emma's still imperceptible womb. "How long?" "12 weeks," she replied quietly, avoiding his gaze. Alexander processed the information in silence. Emma could see the gears of his analytical mind working, calculating dates, connecting events. "Dad," he hesitated, something rare in a man who was always so sure of himself. "It's not on the board," Emma replied, quickly feeling her face burn. It was a one-night stand. He doesn't know, and he doesn't need to know." The businessman got up from his chair and walked over to the hospital window, watching the city of Newport below. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange that contrasted with the smoke still visible coming from the direction of his mansion. "Do you have family here in Rhode Island?" he asked, his back still turned. Emma shook her head. "No. My parents passed away a few years ago, and my only sister lives in California." Alexander turned to face her, his face taking on that determined expression that Emma knew well, the same one he displayed before closing a big deal. "Then it's settled. You're moving into the east wing of the mansion as soon as you're discharged." "What?" Emma straightened up in bed, ignoring the dizziness the sudden movement caused. "I can't accept that." "You can, and you will," Alexander replied in a tone that brooked no argument. "The east wing has an independent entrance and was little affected by the fire. You'll have privacy and all the comfort you need during your pregnancy. But my work, it will remain the same, if you wish, only with the necessary adaptations for your condition." He approached the bed again. "Emma, you risked your life today to save me. Let me repay you by looking after you." There was something in his eyes, an intensity that made Emma's heart skip a beat. It wasn't pity as she had initially feared, it was something deeper, more complex. "Why are you doing this?" she asked in a whisper. Alexander seemed to consider the question for a moment. "Because for 3 years you've looked after not just my house but me. You turned a cold mansion into a home, Emma. And today," he paused, running his hand through his still messy hair, "today you showed me that there is more value in that house than all the antique furniture and works of art combined." A nurse entered the room at that moment, interrupting the conversation to check Emma's vital signs. Alexander took the opportunity to make a few phone calls, organizing Emma's transfer to the suite and giving instructions on cleaning and restoring the mansion. When they were alone again, Emma realized that something fundamental had changed between them. The invisible barriers separating master and maid had begun to crumble like the walls of the mansion during the fire. "Alexander," she said, testing his name for the first time, "I don't want your charity." He approached the bed, sitting on the edge with a familiarity that would have been unthinkable just a few hours ago. "It's not charity, Emma. It's," he paused, searching for the right words, "it's a question of responsibility, of care, of," his voice faltered slightly, "of feelings that perhaps I've ignored for too long." The heart monitor betrayed the acceleration of Emma's heart, making Alexander smile slightly. She blushed but kept her gaze fixed on his. "Tell you what he proposed, take me up on my offer for now. Give us time to understand this," he gestured between them, "whatever it is. No pressure, no expectations. Just two people who have survived something extraordinary together." Emma felt tears forming in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of fear or worry. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, and maybe, just maybe, of hope. "Okay," she agreed softly, "but on one condition." Alexander arched an eyebrow, curious. "You need to stop wearing those expensive suits for casual situations," she said with a small smile. "You look like an executive who's gone through a chimney." Alexander's genuine laughter filled the room, a sound that Emma realized she wanted to hear more often. Much more often. Emma watched her image reflected in the elevator mirror as she ascended to the 4th floor of the Hayes mansion. After a week in hospital, she was finally back, but not as the same person who had left. Her work uniform had been replaced by a casual dress, and her suitcases now occupied the trunk of Alexander's Audi, who had insisted on picking her up personally. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" asked Alexander, standing next to her in the elevator. The gray suit he was wearing matched his eyes perfectly, and Emma couldn't help noticing how much more relaxed he had seemed in recent days. "Honestly, no," she replied with a small smile. "But I suppose no one's really ready for big changes." The elevator opened straight into the east wing, revealing a newly renovated corridor. The smell of fresh paint and new wood still hung in the air, a reminder that part of the mansion was still recovering from the fire. Alexander guided Emma to a double oak door. "Welcome to your new home," he said, opening the doors to reveal a spacious suite decorated in soft shades of blue and cream. The view of the Atlantic Ocean was breathtaking, and a small living room led to a master bedroom in an office. "Alexander, Emma was speechless as she noticed the vintage crib positioned strategically next to the bedroom window. "You didn't need—" "Actually, I did," he replied, placing her suitcases in the closet. "The cradle has belonged to my family for generations. My mother insisted on sending it when she found out, well, about everything." Emma froze. "Does your family know about me?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "They know that you saved my life in the fire and that you're expecting a baby. The details? Well, that's something we can discuss calmly." A comfortable silence settled between them as Emma explored the space. In the small kitchen, she found the fridge stocked with her favorite foods, including the pistachio ice cream she had casually mentioned during her stay at the hospital. "How did you know?" she asked, holding up the jar of ice cream. 3 years of observing your eating habits," he replied with a half smile. "You always bought one at the corner grocery store on your days off." Emma's heart raced as she realized that he was paying more attention to her than she had imagined. "Have you always been this observant?" "Only with the things that matter," Alexander replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her stomach turn. The moment was interrupted by his phone. It was the construction company with updates on the refurbishment of the office on the 3rd floor. Emma took the opportunity to start unpacking, trying to process how her life had changed so drastically in just 1 week. "Emma," Alexander called after ending the call. "There's something else I need to show you." He led her into the office where a new laptop rested on the desk. "Considering that you insist on continuing to work, I thought you'd need a proper space. But on one condition, no unnecessary climbing of stairs. Anything you need from upstairs, use the intercom." "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" Emma joked, but her voice betrayed the emotion she felt. "Almost everything," he replied, his expression turning serious. "We still need to talk about us." Emma felt her heart skip a beat. "Alexander, not today," he interrupted her gently. "You need to settle down, rest. But soon we need to have this conversation." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of tidying up and visits from the mansion staff. Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper, brought tea and cookies, her words laden with motherly concern. The young gardener Mike showed up with a pot of orchids to brighten the mood. Each employee showed in their own way that Emma was more than just a co-worker. When night fell, Emma found herself alone for the first time in her new suite. The sound of the waves breaking against the rocks below created a comforting melody. Sitting in the armchair by the window, her hands resting on her still discreet belly, she allowed the tears to finally fall, not from sadness or fear, but from an emotion she couldn't name. A soft knock on the door roused her from her thoughts. It was Alexander now in more casual attire, jeans, and a gray sweater that made him look younger and more approachable. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I thought you might want some company for dinner." Emma smiled discreetly, wiping away her tears. "That would be lovely." As they walked together to the main dining room, Emma realized that for the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she no longer felt alone. Somehow the fire that had almost destroyed everything had built something new, something undefinable as yet, but full of possibilities. "Emma," Alexander called out, holding out the chair for her to sit down. "Welcome home." And in that moment, watching his genuine smile, Emma knew that whatever the future held, this really was where she belonged. The first council meeting after the fire took place on a rainy fall morning. Alexander adjusted his tie as he watched the members arrive one by one in the temporary conference room on the second floor of the mansion. His thoughts, however, were 3 floors up where Emma was probably organizing her new workspace. "Alex, we need to discuss the damages from the fire," announced Richard Morton, the financial director, spreading papers on the mahogany table. "And there are rumors circulating about personal changes in her life." Alexander kept his expression neutral, although his jaw tensed slightly. "The material damage is covered by insurance, Richard. As for my personal life, it's not on the agenda for this meeting." "It is when it involves a pregnant employee living in your mansion," interfered Victoria Hawthorne, the corporate lawyer. Her shrewd eyes studied Alexander over her gold-framed glasses. "We need to consider the legal implications, and the implications are that I saved the life of someone who risked her own to get me out of a burning building," Alexander cut in his voice, carrying an authority that silenced the room. "Emma Sullivan will remain in the mansion for as long as she wishes. That is not up for discussion." Upstairs, Emma was organizing documents in her new office when she heard a soft knock on the door. It was Mrs. Peterson carrying a tray with ginger tea and lemon cookies. "I thought you might need something for your morning sickness, dear." The housekeeper smiled maternally. "And perhaps someone to talk to." Emma indicated the armchair next to her desk, grateful for the company. "How are the comments among the staff?" "Oh, you know how they are." Mrs. Peterson poured the tea into delicate porcelain cups. "Some romantics think it's like a modern fairy tale. Others," she hesitated, "others think I'm taking advantage of the situation." Emma added, feeling her face heat up. "Nonsense," the housekeeper dismissed with a gesture. "In 15 years working for the Hayes, I've never seen Alexander so alive. Since Caroline died, he's shut down completely." Emma almost dropped her cup. "Caroline," Mrs. Peterson realized her slip too late. "Oh dear, I thought you knew." Caroline was Alexander's wife. "She died 5 years ago in a car accident." Emma's heart squeezed. Suddenly, so many things made sense: the methodical way Alexander led his life, his emotional detachment, the missing photographs on the walls of the mansion. The afternoon progressed with Emma immersed in thoughts about this new revelation. When Alexander knocked on her door at the end of the day, she was still distracted. "Difficult meeting?" she asked, noticing his tired expression. "Nothing I can't handle," he replied, taking a seat in the armchair Mrs. Peterson had occupied earlier. "How was your first official day in the new office?" Emma hesitated, playing with the pen between her fingers. "Alexander, why didn't you ever mention Caroline?" The silence that followed was dense. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, and when he reopened them, there was a vulnerability that Emma had never seen before. "Because talking about her means reliving the guilt," he finally replied. "I should have been in that car. I swapped a romantic trip for a business meeting." Emma stood up, instinctively moving closer to him. "You can't blame yourself for an accident." "I can, and I did for 5 years," he says, voice low, "until a fire and a stubborn employee forced me to face life again." Their gazes met, charged with unspoken emotions. Emma felt the baby move for the first time, as if it had chosen that moment to make itself present. "Oh," she exclaimed, bringing her hand to her belly. Alexander stood up quickly, worried. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, it's just..." She took his hand, guiding it to her belly. "Wait a minute." They stayed like that in silence until the baby moved again. The smile that lit up Alexander's face was transformative, erasing years of sadness in seconds. "This is extraordinary," he whispered, his hand still resting gently on her belly. The closeness between them was electric, charged with possibility. Emma could smell the soft scent of his cologne, see the tiny traces of silver in his dark hair. Alexander moved his free hand to touch her face, his thumb gently tracing her cheek. Emma, he began, his voice hoarse. I need to tell you. The intercom rang, causing them to pull apart abruptly. It was the chef announcing that dinner was served. We should go downstairs, Emma said softly, trying to control her racing heart. Alexander nodded, but before she could move away, he took her hand. Have dinner with me in the Winter Garden tonight. There's a lot we need to talk about. Emma agreed, knowing that this evening could change everything. As they walked side by side through the corridors of the mansion, she realized that it wasn't just the baby that was growing inside her. Her feelings for Alexander were also growing day by day, as inevitable as the tide hitting the rocks outside. The Winter Garden awaited them, illuminated by dozens of tiny lights that looked like earthly stars. It was time for truths to be revealed, hearts to be opened, and maybe, just maybe, a new beginning for both of them. The Winter Garden of the Hayes mansion was a spectacle at night. The glass panels reflected the small lights strategically placed among the exotic plants, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Emma adjusted the navy blue dress Mrs. Peterson had insisted she wore while Alexander supervised the last details of the dinner being served. The wine is just for me, he explained to the sommelier, indicating the only glass on the table. For Miss Sullivan, please serve the pomegranate juice, I requested. The intimacy of the moment didn't go unnoticed by Emma. It was the first time they had dined alone without the presence of other staff or the formality of routine meals. Alexander pulled out a chair for her, a gesture that made her heart race. I thought we could take this moment to be completely honest with each other. He began, taking a seat opposite her. The soft candlelight danced across his face, softening his usually stern features. About Caroline, Emma asked softly, realizing it was time to face the ghost that hovered between them. Alexander nodded, taking a sip of wine before continuing. Caroline was radiant, the kind of person who would light up any room. We met in college. She was studying art history while I was studying business administration. It was a quick and intense romance. Emma observed how his hands lightly squeezed the cup as he spoke, revealing the difficulty in reliving those memories. The accident happened on our last anniversary trip. Or rather, it should have been our trip, he continued, his voice laden with restrained emotion. I canceled it at the last minute because of an important merger. Caroline decided to go alone to our country house in Vermont. The road was slippery because of the rain. Alexander, Emma interrupted, gently reaching across the table to touch his hand. You don't have to go on if it's too painful. He intertwined his fingers with hers, a gesture that seemed to surprise them both. Yes, I do. Because you deserve to know why I keep everyone at a distance. Why I've turned this mansion into a fortress of solitude. The first course was served in asparagus soup that emanated a delicate aroma. Emma waited patiently while Alexander organized his thoughts. After the funeral, I immersed myself in work. I turned Hayes Enterprises into one of the largest technology companies on the East Coast, but at the expense of any real emotional connection, he continued. Until you arrived, Emma felt her heart skip a beat. May, you've brought life back to this house, Emma. Not just with your efficiency or professionalism, but with your humanity. The way you treat each employee, how you know their stories, their families. It was the first time in 5 years that I saw these walls witness genuine laughter. The baby chose that moment to move again, as if to take part in the conversation. Emma smiled, instinctively putting her hand to her belly. And now, Alexander continued, his eyes fixed on her. You're bringing new life into these walls. It's like the universe is giving me a second chance to do things right. Alexander, Emma began, feeling tears forming in her eyes. I don't want to be your redemption. I can't carry that weight. That's not what I'm asking, he replied, quickly getting up to kneel beside her. I'm asking for a chance to be there, to be part of this journey. Not as your boss, not as someone trying to make amends, but as a man who was discovering that his heart is still capable of feeling something he thought he had lost forever. The silence that followed was filled only by the soft buzz of the fountain in the center of the garden. Emma could feel the warmth of his hand, on hers the weight of his words, the intensity of his gaze. I'm afraid, she finally admitted. Afraid of mixing things up, of confusing gratitude with something deeper. Afraid that one day you'll look at me and this baby and see only reminders of what you've lost, not promises of what you can gain. Alexander stood up, gently pulling Emma to stand with him. The garden lights created a soft halo around them, as if they were in their own private universe. "So let's find out together," he proposed, his hands gently framing her face. "One day at a time, no pressure and no expectations other than those we build up naturally." Emma closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the moment in all its intensity. When she opened them again, she found Alexander looking at her with a mixture of tenderness and determination that made her heart soar. "One day at a time," she agreed softly. Dinner continued, but something fundamental had changed. The unspoken words had finally found a voice, and the ghosts of the past, although still present, seemed less frightening when faced together. When dessert was served, a chocolate mousse that made Emma's eyes sparkle, Alexander smiled as he watched her savor each spoonful with evident pleasure. "You know," he commented, "I think Caroline would approve. She always said that life was too short not to enjoy the little joys." Emma smiled back, realizing that perhaps there was enough room in their hearts to honor the past while building a completely new future. News of the new situation at the Hayes mansion spread quickly through Newport's social circles. One particularly hectic morning, Emma found several local tabloids speculating about her relationship with Alexander, some with sensationalist headlines that made her shudder. "Don't pay any attention to that," Alexander said, removing the newspapers from her sight during breakfast. "I'll see to it that our legal department takes the necessary steps." But it wasn't just the tabloids that caused Emma anxiety. As her pregnancy became more visible, she began to notice glances and whispers from the more traditional members of high society who frequented the mansion for business meetings. Mr. Hayes, Charlotte Waverly, an important shareholder, approached Alexander after a board meeting. "May I have a word in private?" Emma, who was organizing documents near the conference room door, couldn't help overhearing the conversation that followed. "Alexander, dear, you need to consider your reputation." Charlotte's voice was sweet but laced with venom. "First the fire, now this peculiar arrangement. People are talking. People always talk, Charlotte." Alexander's reply was cutting. "And as for my reputation, it was built on hard work and integrity, not salon gossip." That evening, Emma found refuge in the Winter Garden, her favorite spot in the mansion. The rain beat against the glass panels, creating a melancholy melody that matched her mood. "I thought I'd find you here," Alexander's voice surprised her. He was carrying 2 cups of tea, handing one to her. "Chamomile with honey, your favorite." "How was the meeting with the Japanese investors?" she asked, trying to divert the subject from her worries. "Productive," he replied, taking a seat next to her on the park bench. "But that's not what's bothering you, is it?" Emma sighed, her hands wrapping around the hot cup. "Maybe Charlotte Waverly is right. Your life would be much simpler without all this complication." "Simple doesn't mean better," Alexander replied, his gaze fixed on the storm outside. "Before the fire, my life was perfectly organized and completely empty." Thunder echoed in the distance, causing Emma to startle slightly. Alexander instinctively put his arm around her, a protective gesture that was becoming increasingly natural between them. "I receive an interesting call today," he continued. "From your sister Claire." Emma froze. "Like you. I have my resources," he smiled. "She's worried about you. Apparently your calls have been short and evasive over the last few weeks." "I don't want to worry her," Emma admitted. "Claire has her own life in California, her own problems." "She's coming tomorrow," Alexander announced casually, as if he hadn't just dropped a bombshell. "What?" Emma almost dropped her cup. "You didn't." "I've arranged your ticket and accommodation in the best hotel in town," he confirmed. "Emma, you need your family right now. And frankly, I think we all need a little more honesty in our lives." The tears Emma had been holding back began to fall. "But what if she doesn't understand? What if she thinks I'm making a mistake?" Alexander gently dried her tears with his thumb. "Then we'll deal with it together. Just like we've been dealing with everything lately." The baby chose that moment to wiggle vigorously, as if to join in the conversation. Emma couldn't help but smile a little. "See, even this little warrior agrees." Alexander teased, his hand resting gently on her belly. "Or warrior," Emma corrected, placing her hand on his. The moment was interrupted by Mrs. Peterson, who hurried into the Winter Garden. "Mr. Hayes, pardon the intrusion, but there is a situation that requires your immediate attention." Alexander reluctantly got up, but before he left he leaned over and for the first time gently kissed Emma's forehead. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a great day." Alone again, Emma watched the storm through the glass panels. The raindrops created hypnotic patterns reminding her of the tears she had shed in recent weeks, some of fear, some of joy, and some like now of an emotion she wasn't yet ready to name. Claire's arrival would mean facing truths she had been avoiding. Her sister had always been perceptive, able to see through any facade. How would she explain the complexity of her feelings for Alexander? How could she justify the choices that had brought her here? Meanwhile, in the corridors of the mansion, Alexander was facing his own demons. The photo of Caroline that he kept in his drawer seemed to smile approvingly. Perhaps he thought it was time to bring her back to the walls of the mansion, not as a haunting ghost, but as part of a story that had led him to this moment to Emma. The storm continued outside, but inside the Hayes mansion, something new and fragile was beginning to bloom like the orchids Emma loved so much, delicate, resilient, and absolutely extraordinary. Claire Sullivan's arrival at T.F. Green International Airport was marked by a tight embrace between the sisters. Emma could hardly hold back the tears at seeing her only family after so long. Claire, with her red hair and the freckles that have always set them apart, examined her sister from top to bottom, her green eyes identical to Emma's widening as she noticed her already visible belly. "My God, Emma," Claire whispered, her hands gently touching her sister's belly. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Alexander watched the scene from a distance, giving the sisters the space they needed for their reunion. When he finally approached, Claire studied him with an analytical gaze that was very reminiscent of Emma's. "So you're the famous Alexander Hayes," she said, holding out her hand. "The man who turned my sister from a maid into the princess of the tower." "Claire," Emma protested, but Alexander just smiled. "Your sister remains exactly who she always was," he replied diplomatically. "It's the mansion that's become a better place because of her." The drive to the hotel was filled with superficial conversation about the trip, but Emma could sense the interrogation to come. Claire was always the more direct of the two, and Emma knew she wouldn't escape her questions for long. "We'll have dinner at 7, Alexander informed them as he dropped them off at the hotel. Before leaving, he briefly held Emma's hand, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Claire. As soon as they were alone in the luxurious room, Claire crossed her arms. "Okay, little sister, time for the truth. What's really going on here?" Emma sat on the edge of the king's size bed, her hands nervously smoothing her mother's dress. "It's complicated, Claire." "It always is," Claire replied, taking a seat next to her sister. "Start with the basics. Is the baby his?" "No," Emma answered quickly. "It was one night a few months ago with someone who doesn't matter anymore." Claire frowned. "And yet he's looking after you like your Prince Charming." "Emma, you've always been the sensible one in the family." "What's changed?" Emma told her about the fire, about how Alexander had saved her, about Caroline, and the last few weeks at the manor. Claire listened intently, her face alternating between concern and curiosity. "You're in love with him," Claire concluded. It wasn't a question. Emma felt her face burn. I don't know. It all happens so fast, Claire. Sometimes it feels like I'm living in a dream, and I'm afraid I'll wake up and realize I've made a terrible mistake." "And him, how does he feel about you?" "It's complicated," Emma repeated. "He lost his wife in a tragic way, and sometimes I wonder if I'm just a form of redemption for him." Claire held her sister's hands. "And I've seen the way he looks at you. That's not the look of someone seeking redemption. It's the look of someone who's found something they didn't even know they were looking for." The tears Emma had been holding back began to fall. "I'm scared, Claire. Afraid of giving myself over to these feelings and ending up hurt. Afraid that when the baby is born, everything will change." "Fear is natural," Claire hugged her. "But you've always been the braver of the two of us, even if you don't realize it. Remember when you ran away to Rhode Island after Mom and Dad died? Everyone thought you were crazy, but look how far you've come." The rest of the afternoon was spent with the sisters, catching up, sharing memories and fears. When it was time for dinner, Emma felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Alexander was waiting for them in the hotel restaurant, having chosen a more neutral setting for their first family dinner. His expression softened visibly at the sight of Emma, another detail that Claire didn't miss. During dinner, Claire observed the dynamic between her sister and Alexander. The way he subtly checked that Emma was comfortable, how their gazes met in quiet conversation, how he smiled more easily when she was around. "So Alexander," Claire began after dessert, "what are your intentions with my sister?" Claire, Emma almost choked on her pistachio ice cream. Alexander, however, kept his composure. My intentions are to offer whatever support and protection Emma wishes to accept for as long as she wants to remain in my life. What if she wants more than support and protection?" Claire pressed. "Then I'll be the luckiest man in Rhode Island," he replied, simply, his eyes meeting Emma's with an intensity that made her heart race. Later, when Alexander dropped them back at the hotel, Claire hugged her sister before going to sleep. "You know, maybe modern fairy tales don't need perfect princes. Maybe they just need real people willing to face their fears together." Emma fell asleep thinking about her sister's words, her hand resting on her belly where her baby was moving gently. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she allowed herself to dream of a future where she wasn't alone, a future where fears and hopes could coexist, where love could be born from the ashes of past losses, and where second chances weren't just dreams, but real possibilities. Claire's visit brought a new dynamic to the Hayes mansion. After a week of observing the interaction between her sister and Alexander, she began to notice patterns that Emma, perhaps because she was too close to the situation, did not. Like the way Alexander unconsciously positioned himself protectively when Emma was around, or how his eyes constantly sought her out during meals. "You need to see this," Claire said one morning, pulling Emma into the library. On the antique desk rested a pile of old newspapers. "I found it while researching the Hayes family." Emma took the newspaper from the top of the pile, dated 5 years ago. The headline announced the tragic accident that had taken Caroline Hayes' life. But that wasn't what caught her eye. Was the photograph of Alexander at the funeral, his face ravaged by grief, holding a small parcel in his arms. "What's this?" Emma asked, her heart racing. "Caroline was 6 months pregnant when she died," Claire replied softly. "They were going to have a girl." Emma sat down heavily in the nearest armchair, her hand instinctively going to her own belly. Suddenly, so many things made sense. The vintage crib, the way Alexander had reacted to her pregnancy, his heightened protective instinct. "Miss Sullivan," Mrs. Peterson appeared at the door, interrupting the moment. "Mr. Hayes requests your presence in his office." Emma found Alexander arranging some photographs on his desk. Her heart almost stopped when she recognized Caroline, in one of them a beautiful woman with golden hair and a radiant smile. "I thought it was time to bring them back," Alexander said without turning around. "Claire convinced me that hiding the past doesn't make it any less real." "Why don't you tell me about the baby?" Emma asked softly, moving closer. Alexander finally turned his eyes, revealing an old pain. "How do you tell something like that? By the way, not only did I lose my wife, but also our unborn daughter, Charlotte," Emma said suddenly. "You were going to call her Charlotte, weren't you?" Alexander nodded, picking up a small picture frame. On an ultrasound image showed the delicate profile of a baby. Caroline chose the name. She said it would be our little princess. Emma felt tears run down her face. "I'm sorry you had to go through this alone." "I'm not alone anymore," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "And maybe that's why fate put you in my path. Not to replace what I've lost, but to show me that there's still room for love in this house." The baby chose that moment to move vigorously, causing Emma to let out a small exclamation. Alexander approached his hand, finding the exact spot where the baby was kicking. "It's a girl," Emma revealed softly. She had found out at the last appointment, but had been waiting for the right moment to tell him. Alexander remained motionless for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Emma's surprise, he smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "A girl," he repeated, his voice charged with emotion. "Emma, Mr. Hayes," his assistant's voice interrupted the moment. "The Japanese investors are on the line." Alexander reluctantly walked away, but before returning to his desk, he leaned over and for the first time kissed Emma softly on the lips. It was a brief, almost shy kiss, but one laden with promise. "Have dinner with me tonight," he said. "Just the two of us. There's a lot we need to talk about." Emma nodded, her heart pounding wildly. When she left the office, she found Claire waiting in the hallway with a knowing smile. "So," her sister said, "I think we've finally found the last chapter of this story." "No," Emma corrected, touching her lips where she could still feel Alexander's kiss. "I think we've just found the beginning." That evening, as she prepared for dinner, Emma reflected on how life could change so drastically in such a short space of time. A few months ago, she was just another employee trying to hide an unexpected pregnancy. Now she was at the center of a story of redemption and second chances that not even the most romantic of romances could have predicted. The emerald green dress Claire had insisted she, by gently hugged her pregnant figure. When she went downstairs, she found Alexander waiting at the foot of the stairs, his eyes shining in a way that made her heart leap. "You look beautiful," he said, simply offering his arm. As they walked towards the winter garden where dinner was served, Emma realized that she was no longer afraid of the future. Whatever the road ahead, they would face it together, not as employer and employee, not as two people broken by the past, but as two hearts that had found healing in each other. And somewhere Emma was sure Caroline was smiling. Dinner in the winter garden turned out to be more intimate than Emma could have imagined. Alexander had transformed the space into a private oasis with candles strategically placed among the exotic plants and soft music playing in the background. The table for two was elegantly set next to the fountain, where the water created a relaxing melody. "You look different tonight," Emma observed as Alexander poured wine for himself and pomegranate juice for her. "More lighter, talking about Caroline, about Charlotte." It was like removing a weight I didn't even know I was still carrying, he admitted, his eyes meeting hers. "And a lot of that is thanks to your sister?" Emma smiled, thinking of Claire. "She has this gift of making people face their truths even when they don't want to." Speaking of truths, Alexander placed his glass on the table, his expression turning serious. "There's something I need to tell you. About the night of the fire." Emma's heart raced. "What about it? When you collapsed in my arms, you mumbled something about the baby. At that moment, I felt a fear I hadn't experienced since." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Since I lost Caroline and Charlotte. But it was different. It wasn't just fear of losing someone, it was fear of losing you, specifically you, Emma." The confession hung between them like a cloud charged with electricity. Emma felt her throat tighten with emotion. "That night," he continued, "I realized that I wasn't just offering shelter to a pregnant employee. I was trying to protect someone who, without my realizing it, had become essential in my life." "Alexander," Emma began, but he gently placed his hand over hers. "Please let me finish. For 5 years, I turned this mansion into a mausoleum of memories. Every corridor, every room was a reminder of what I had lost. Then you arrived with your quiet efficiency and gentle heart. You started to change things, small details, first like fresh flowers in the library or music in the kitchen during breakfast." Emma remembered those moments, the small changes she had implemented, always fearing she was overstepping boundaries. "You brought life back to this place," Alexander continued, his voice laced with emotion. "And when I found out about your pregnancy, something inside me awoke. It wasn't pain or bitter memories, it was hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the universe was giving me a second chance to make things right." The baby moved as if responding to his words. Emma guided Alexander's hand to the spot where her daughter was kicking. "She always moves when she hears your voice," Emma revealed softly, "as if she already knows you're important." Alexander smiled, that rare smile that completely transformed his face. "Emma, I'm not asking you to replace her biological father. I'm not asking for anything, really. I'm just saying that if you allow it, I'd like to be a part of both of your lives. Not as a boss, not as a protector, but as someone you love," Emma added in a whisper. "Yes," he replied, his voice firm despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "As someone who loves you, Emma Sullivan, with all your particularities, with all your fears and dreams. Who already loves this little girl who hasn't even arrived yet, simply because she's part of you." The tears that Emma had been holding back began to fall freely. Alexander got up from his chair and knelt down beside her. "I'm not asking for an answer now," he said softly, wiping away her tears. "I know there's a lot to consider, a lot to process. I just wanted you to know that my heart, which I thought was permanently closed, has found its way back to life through you." Emma held his face between her hands, observing every detail, the small silver hairs at his temples, the soft lines around his eyes, the almost imperceptible scar over his right eyebrow. This man who bore his own scars with such dignity was offering his bruised but resilient heart. "I love you too," she replied simply, because sometimes the deepest truths are best expressed with the simplest words. The kiss that followed was different from the first, no longer shy or hesitant, but deep and full of promise. When they parted, they were both smiling through their tears. "So what happens now?" Emma asked, her forehead resting against his. "Now," Alexander replied, "we start our own story. No pressure, no expectations, other than the ones we create together. One day at a time." And there in the Winter Garden, where so many important conversations had taken place, where so many truths had been revealed, Emma finally understood that sometimes love doesn't arrive like in fairy tales. Sometimes it arrives through fires and losses, through fears and hesitations, through second chances that fate gently places in our path. The news of Alexander Hayes and Emma Sullivan's relationship spread through the mansion like fire through dry straw. Mrs. Peterson smiled discreetly as she supervised the breakfast preparations, observing how her boss now made a point of taking every meal with Emma, their hands often meeting on the table in discreet gestures of affection. Claire, who had extended her stay for a few more weeks, watched her sister's transformation with a mixture of joy and protective concern. One particularly sunny morning, she found Emma organizing the old nursery that would be transformed for her daughter. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Claire asked, watching Emma run her hand over the Hayes vintage crib. "Actually, it was my idea," Emma replied, delicately folding a pair of tiny overalls. "Alexander kept all of Charlotte's things in boxes in the attic. I thought maybe it was time to give this space a new meaning. And he's okay with that." It was hard at first, Emma admitted, taking a seat in the nursing chair. "We spent a whole evening hearing him telling me about the plans he'd made with Caroline, about how he imagined his life as a father. We cried together, Claire. It was as if we could finally share not only the present, but also the weight of the past." A movement at the door caught the sisters' attention. Alexander was standing there holding an old box. His eyes revealed a mixture of emotions as he saw Emma in the armchair where Caroline used to sit to plan Charlotte's room. "I found a few more things in the attic," he said softly, entering the room, "including this." Inside the box was a delicate mobile made of tiny crystal angels that sparkled in the sunlight. "It's been in the Hayes family for generations," Alexander explained. "Every baby in the family slept under it." Emma felt tears forming in her eyes, something that had been happening frequently lately. "It's beautiful, Alexander, but I can't." "Yes, you can," he interrupted her, gently kneeling down beside her. "Emma, you and this little one," his hand rested on her belly, "are my family now. And families share not only the present and the future, but also their histories, their traditions." Claire discreetly left the room, understanding that this moment belonged only to the two of them. In the hallway, she met Mrs. Peterson, who was carrying a tray with tea and cookies. "They need this, you know," the housekeeper commented, placing the tray on a side table. "This mutual healing. Mr. Hayes was lost for so long, and his sister? Well, she always took care of others, but rarely allowed them to take care of her." Inside the room, Emma and Alexander continued their intimate conversation. He had sat on the arm of the armchair, his fingers intertwined in hers, as they discussed colors for the walls and places for the furniture. "I was thinking," Alexander said hesitantly, "how Caroline would love to see this room full of life again." Emma squeezed his hand gently. "Tell me more about her. What she was like in the small moments on Sunday mornings or stormy nights." Alexander smiled, his eyes lost in memories. "She loved dancing in the rain. Literally. She always said that life was too short to worry about keeping her hair tidy. I think that's why I was so attracted to you from the start. You have that same way of seeing beauty in the simple things. Like making breakfast for employees on national holiday." Emma teased, remembering the times she'd made pancakes for the staff on special dates. "Exactly," he laughed softly. "Caroline would have loved that. She would have loved you, actually. Your quiet strength, your natural goodness." The baby chose that moment to kick particularly hard, making Emma gasp. Alexander immediately squirmed, worried, but she smiled. "It's all right," she assured him. "I think she just wants to join in the conversation. She's already as strong as her mother," he commented, his eyes shining with admiration. Emma felt her heart race at the way he looked at her, as if she was something precious and strong at the same time. "Alexander, sometimes I wonder if all this isn't going too fast. If we're not leaving the past behind too quickly," he added. "Emma, we're not erasing the past, we're building on it. Caroline taught me to love, to be vulnerable. You're teaching me to love again, to believe in second chances. And you're teaching me to accept help, not to carry everything alone," she admitted softly. The afternoon sun created golden patterns on the floor, through the lace curtains, and the crystal marble cast little rainbows across the walls. It was a moment of perfect peace, the kind of moment that both Emma and Alexander had forgotten could exist. "Do you know what else Caroline used to say?" Alexander asked, his voice soft. "That true love isn't about finding someone perfect, but finding someone who helps you become a better version of yourself." Emma felt tears run down her face, but this time there were tears of joy, of gratitude for this moment, for this man, for all the circumstances that had brought them there. "Then I guess we found true love," she whispered, pulling him into a soft kiss. In the hallway, Claire and Mrs. Peterson exchanged knowing glances before quietly walking away, leaving the couple in their moment of intimacy. The tea would cool on the tray, but some things were more important than routines and schedules. The Hayes mansion, which for so long had been a monument to loss, was beginning to pulsate with new life. And in the former nursery, now bright with hope and possibilities, two bruised hearts continued their journey of healing, discovering that sometimes the deepest love is born not only from joy, but also from a mutual understanding of pain and the courage to try again. News of the romance between Alexander Hayes and Emma Sullivan finally reached the Newport tabloids, generating sensationalist headlines that ranged from modern fairy tales to vicious speculation. One particularly hectic morning, Victoria Hawthorne, the corporate lawyer, called an emergency meeting. "We need to make an official announcement," Victoria declared, spreading the papers out on the conference room table. "The shareholders are nervous about the possible repercussions on the company's image." Alexander, sitting at the head of the table, maintained his usual composure, although Emma could notice the tension in his shoulders. "Hayes Enterprises doesn't owe any satisfaction about my personal life." "With all due respect, Alex," Richard Morton interjected, "when your personal life involves a pregnant employee living in your mansion, it affects the company. The shares have dropped 3 points since the photos of you in the restaurant came to light." Emma, who was attending the meeting at Alexander's request, felt her stomach turn. It wasn't just pregnancy sickness, it was the weight of seeing how her presence in his life was causing problems. "Then I'll make it simple." Alexander stood up, his voice carrying that tone that brooked no contest. "Emma isn't just a pregnant employee. She's the woman I love and who will soon be my wife." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma looked at him, shocked. They had never discussed marriage. "Alexander," she began, but he continued. "Of course that's how she accepts," he smiled, turning to face her. "This isn't how I plan to propose, but considering that our history has never followed the conventional path." Victoria snorted, clearly uncomfortable. "Maybe we should give you a moment." "No," Emma said, surprising everyone, including herself. "Do you want an official statement? Here it is. I'm Emma Sullivan. I'm pregnant with a child who is not biologically Alexander Hayes. I've been working in this mansion for 3 years, and yes, I've fallen in love with my boss. But more importantly, I have found a man who has chosen to love not only me, but also my unborn child." The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. Richard Morton looked bewildered while Victoria tried to hide a smile. "That was unexpectedly honest," the lawyer commented. "Honesty is something I learned from Emma," Alexander said, approaching her. "So if I'll be honest now, I don't care about the company's shares or press speculation. What I do care about is building a life with the woman who brought light back into my days." Kneeling down in front of her, Alexander pulled a small box out of his jacket pocket. "This isn't how I planned to do it. I had a whole romantic dinner organized for this weekend with music and flowers. But I realized that the perfect moment is any moment when I'm with you." Emma felt tears run down her face as he opened the box, revealing a delicate sapphire ring surrounded by small diamonds. "Emma Sullivan, you taught me that love isn't just about perfect moments, but about being there for the imperfect ones too. You showed me that family isn't just about blood ties, but about daily choices to love and support. You gave me a second chance at life when I didn't even know I needed one." So he took a trembling hand. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The baby chose that moment to kick particularly hard, making Emma laugh through her tears. "I think someone's already having their say." "Is that a yes?" Alexander asked, his eyes shining with hope. "It's a yes," she replied softly. The conference room, normally the scene of tense negotiations and corporate decisions, erupted in applause. Even Richard Morton seemed moved, discreetly wiping his eyes. While Victoria said, gathering up her papers, "I think we have our official announcement." Businessman Alexander Hayes announces engagement to Emma Sullivan in touching display of true love that should make the shares go up again. Later that evening, Emma found Claire in the winter garden, her favorite spot in the mansion. Her sister was examining the ring with a knowing smile. "So how does it feel to be the future, Mrs. Hayes?" Claire teased. "Honestly, a bit scared," Emma admitted. "It's all so fast, so intense." "Sometimes love is like that," Claire replied, hugging her sister. "It arrives like wildfire, destroying all our defenses, but also illuminating paths we didn't even know existed." The sound of footsteps made the sisters turn around. Alexander was standing in the doorway, having swapped his formal suit for more casual clothes. "Am I interrupting something?" he asked. "Actually, I was just leaving," Claire winked at Emma. "I have an important call to make to our aunt in Sacramento. She's going to freak when she hears the news." Alone, Emma and Alexander sat on the bench next to the fountain, their fingers intertwined naturally. "Are you okay with all this?" he asked softly. "I am," she replied, realizing it was true. "Scared but fine. It's like you said, the perfect moment is any moment we're together." Alexander smiled, pulling her closer. "Do you know what Caroline used to say, that true love doesn't need special occasions, it makes any occasion special?" "She was a wise woman," Emma commented, resting her head on his shoulder. "Yes, she was," Alexander agreed. "And I'm sure she's smiling now, seeing that I've finally found my way back to happiness." The organization of the wedding brought a new dynamic to the Hayes mansion. Emma, now 7 months pregnant, watched with a mixture of amusement and apprehension as Victoria Hawthorne transformed the living room into a command center for the event. "The flowers need to be white," Victoria insisted, showing Mrs. Peterson catalogs. "Roses and lilies, elegant arrangements, but not ostentatious." And Alexander was specific about holding the ceremony here in the garden of the mansion. Emma stroked her prominent belly, feeling her daughter move. "We don't need something so elaborate. A justice of the peace and our immediate family would be enough." "Darling," Mrs. Peterson smiled maternally, "you're marrying one of the most influential men in Rhode Island. People expect a certain standard." "The people or the press?" Emma asked, remembering the headlines that still occasionally circulated. "Both," Victoria answered pragmatically. "But mainly Alexander. He wants to give you the marriage you deserve." As if summoned by the conversation, Alexander entered the room, immediately noticing Emma's worried expression. "Is everything all right?" he asked, taking a seat next to her on the sofa. "Your fiancé is having second thoughts about the grandeur of the event," Victoria explained, organizing her notes. "Emma," Alexander took her hand, his eyes searching hers. "If you prefer something more intimate, it's not exactly doubts," she explained, gently squeezing his fingers. "It's just that it all feels like a dream sometimes. Like I'm gonna wake up back in my old maid's room, alone and scared." Alexander pulled her closer, his arm wrapping protectively around her shoulders. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life showing you that this is real, that we're real." Victoria and Mrs. Peterson discreetly left the room, giving the couple a moment of privacy. Emma rested her head on Alexander's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne. "I got a letter today," she said softly, "from the baby's father." Alexander tensed slightly, but kept his voice calm. He's in California. Claire must have managed to track him down," Emma continued. "He has officially renounced any parental rights. He said it's for the best, that he's not ready to be a father." "How do you feel about that?" Emma considered the question for a moment. "Relieved, actually. Not because he doesn't want to be part of her life, but because now there's nothing stopping you from legally being her father. If you still want to." Alexander moved to face her, his hands gently framing her face. "Emma, from the moment I felt her move for the first time, I knew I was already her father in my heart. The paper will only make official what is already true." The tears Emma had been holding back began to fall. "Hormones," she murmured, making Alexander smile. "Speaking of fatherhood," he said, helping her to her feet, "I have a surprise for you." He led her up to the 3rd floor, where the baby's room was almost ready. But instead of going in there, Alexander took her to a door she had never noticed before. "This was my personal refuge," he explained, opening the door. "The place where I kept my most precious memories." The room was small but cozy, with shelves covering the walls. On one of them, Emma noticed photographs of Caroline at different times, smiling in her wedding dress, playing the piano, caressing her pregnant belly. Alexander, she hesitated, unsure how to react. Look closer, he encouraged softly. Emma then realized that there were new photographs mixed in with the old ones. She and Alexander in the winter garden, their hands intertwined over her belly. Claire making faces at the camera during a Sunday lunch. Mrs. Peterson teaching Emma how to make Alexander's favorite chocolate cake. This is no longer just a shrine to the past, Alexander explained, his voice laced with emotion. It's a testament to how love can take many forms, many stories. Caroline will always be part of who I am, just as this little 1 inch, he touched Emma's belly, will be part of who you are. And together we're writing our own story. Emma looked at the photographs, noticing how they told not just individual stories, but the evolution of a family. It's perfect, she whispered. There's still plenty of room on the shelves, Alexander commented, hugging her from behind. For more memories, more moments, more love. The baby kicked particularly hard, making them both laugh. I think she approves, Emma smiled. Of course she does, Alexander replied, kissing her neck softly. She's a Hayes after all, even if not officially yet. Emma turned in his arms, her eyes meeting his. 2 weeks, she said. In 2 weeks, I'll officially be Emma Hayes. And I'll officially be the luckiest man in Rhode Island, he added, leaning in to kiss her. The kiss was interrupted by Victoria knocking on the door. Sorry to interrupt, but the florist is here for final approval of the arrangements. Emma and Alexander exchanged a complicit glance before following Victoria. As they descended the stairs, Emma took one last look at the memory room, realizing that it wasn't just a space for memories. It was a reminder that true love doesn't erase the past, but builds bridges between it and the future. And at the Hayes mansion, those bridges were being built with every shared smile, every moment of mutual understanding, every small step towards a future that neither of them had imagined possible a few months ago. The morning of the wedding dawned with a soft autumn breeze swaying the curtains of the Hayes mansion. Emma, now almost 8 months pregnant, watched the final preparations in the garden through the window of her suite, while Claire adjusted the last details of her wedding dress. I still can't believe we managed to adapt this Vera-worn dress to accommodate your belly, Claire commented, delicately adjusting the folds of the fabric. You look absolutely stunning. The dress, in a soft shade of ivory, had been specially modified to enhance Emma's advanced pregnancy. The sweetheart neckline and French lace sleeves created an elegant silhouette, while the flowing skirt fell gracefully over her belly. Mrs. Peterson has been crying since 6 this morning. Emma smiled, remembering how the housekeeper had shown up in a room with special breakfast and tears in her eyes. She said that finally the Hayes mansion will have a real family again. A soft knock on the door interrupted the conversation. It was Victoria Hawthorne, surprisingly emotional in her role as wedding coordinator. The guests are arriving and Alexander is, well, let's just say I've never seen her so nervous at a shareholders meeting. Emma felt her heart race. Over the last few weeks, as the wedding preparations had intensified, she and Alexander had grown even closer. Each evening was dedicated to deep conversations in the winter garden, sharing fears, dreams, and memories. Emma, Claire's voice brought her back to the present. There's someone special who wants to see you before the ceremony. To her surprise, an elegant lady with silver hair entered the room. Eleanor Hayes, Alexander's mother, was carrying a small blue velvet box. My dear, Eleanor approached, her eyes shining with restrained tears. Alexander asked me to give you this. It was my grandmother's, then mine, then Caroline's, and now. She opened the box, revealing a delicate pearl necklace. It's yours. Emma touched the pearls, gently feeling the weight of the family history they carried. Mrs. Hayes, Eleanor, please, the matriarch smiled. And before you say anything, I need you to know you're not replacing anyone. You're adding your own light to this family. The baby chose that moment to kick particularly hard, making all the women laugh. Eleanor gently placed the necklace on Emma, her expert hands adjusting it perfectly. Ready, Claire asked, offering the bouquet of white roses and lilies. Emma took a deep breath, looking at her reflection one last time. The pearl necklace glowed softly against her skin, perfectly matching the engagement ring Alexander had chosen. In the garden, the guests were already settled. Alexander was waiting at the makeshift altar flanked by arches of white flowers. When the music started, a soft melody played by a string quartet, he turned around, and his expression when he saw Emma was breathtaking. Every step towards the altar was a step towards her future. Emma could see Mrs. Peterson weeping discreetly in the front row, Claire smiling proudly as godmother, and the staff of the mansion mingling with the executives of Hayes Enterprises, all united to celebrate this moment. "You look absolutely stunning," Alexander whispered when she finally reached the altar. His eyes shone with an emotion that made Emma's heart race. The ceremony was intimate and emotional. When it came time for the vows, Alexander took Emma's hands between his. "Emma Sullivan," he began, his voice charged with emotion, "you came into my life like a ray of light in the midst of darkness. Not only did you save me from a fire, but you saved my soul from years of isolation. I promise to honor and protect not only you, but also our little miracle every day of our lives." Emma took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. "Alexander Hayes, you showed me that true love isn't just about perfect moments, but about choosing to be present in the imperfect moments too. I promise to build with you a life full of laughter, understanding, and unconditional love." When the celebrant declared the man and wife, the garden erupted in applause. The kiss that sealed their union was sweet and promising, full of promises for the future. The reception that followed was a celebration of love in all its forms. Eleanor Hayes danced with her son, her tears of joy mingling with his. Claire gave an emotional toast to her sister, recalling how Emma had always been the strength of the family. But the most touching moment came when Alexander guided Emma into the memory room, now transformed with new wedding photographs already being added to the shelves. "Welcome to the Hayes family, Mrs. Hayes," he smiled, kissing her softly. Emma touched her womb, feeling her daughter move. "The three of us are a family now. We always will be," Alexander promised, his hand joining hers on her belly. "And this is just the beginning of our story." Winter arrived in Newport, bringing with it the first flakes of snow, which fell softly on the gardens of the Hayes mansion. Emma, now in her 9th month of pregnancy, watched the scenery through the conservatory window, her hands absent-mindedly caressing her belly, while Alexander finished the last details of the baby's room. "Do you think everything is ready?" she asked, feeling a familiar twinge that had become more frequent over the last few hours. "The crib is set up, the diapers are organized by size, and Mrs. Peterson has stocked up on enough food to feed a small army," Alexander replied, coming up to hug her from behind. "But you don't look well. What's wrong?" Emma took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "The contraction started a few hours ago. I didn't want to worry you in the middle of the meeting with the Japanese investors." Alexander turned her to face him, her eyes wide with worry. "Why didn't you call me immediately? Because I know you," she smiled, even as another contraction made her squeeze his hand. "You would have canceled everything and panicked." "How can I not panic? Our daughter is coming." He was already picking up the phone, calling the driver and alerting the hospital. Mrs. Peterson appeared as if by magic, carrying the suitcase she had prepared weeks before. "I've already alerted Claire. She's taking the first flight out of San Francisco." The housekeeper informed him, her usual efficiency mixed with obvious emotion. The drive to the hospital was a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Alexander held Emma's hand with every contraction, whispering words of encouragement while trying to maintain his own composure. At the hospital, the medical team was already waiting for them, thanks to the prior arrangements Alexander had made. Dr. Sarah Matthews, the obstetrician who had accompanied Emma from the start, welcomed them with a reassuring smile. "Looks like someone decided to join the Hayes family a little early," the doctor commented, examining Emma. "You're in active labor. Let's get everything ready to welcome this little one." The next few hours were a roller coaster of emotions. Emma, always so strong and independent, allowed herself to be vulnerable, squeezing Alexander's hand and letting the tears flow freely during the most intense contractions. "You're doing great," Alexander whispered, wiping her face with a cold towel. "You're the most incredible woman I've ever met." "Alexander," Emma gasped between contractions, "I need to tell you something." "Anything, my love?" "I've chosen a name for her." She took a deep breath, preparing for another contraction. "Charlotte Caroline Hayes." Alexander was silent for a moment, his eyes watery with emotion. "It's perfect," he finally managed to say. "Absolutely perfect." Dr. Matthews returned for another examination. "It's time, Emma. Your daughter is ready to meet her parents." The next few minutes were intense, with Emma mustering all her strength to bring her daughter into the world. Alexander stayed by her side, his presence constant and comforting even when his own anxiety threatened to overwhelm him. And then amidst the snow falling outside, Charlotte's loud cry filled the room. Dr. Matthews placed the small bundle on Emma's chest, and the world seemed to stop for a moment. "She's beautiful," Alexander whispered, gently touching his daughter's little hand. "As perfect as her mother." Charlotte opened her little eyes, revealing a shade of green reminiscent of Emma's eyes. Her little face had delicate features, and a fluff of dark hair covered her head. "Welcome to the world, little Charlotte," Emma murmured, kissing her daughter's forehead. "You're so loved." Alexander leaned over, hugging his family. "You two are my greatest miracle," he said, his voice breaking. "I never thought I could feel so much love like this." Hours later, in the private room, where Emma rested with Charlotte in her arms, they began to receive visitors. Claire arrived first, having secured a direct flight thanks to Alexander. "She's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Claire declared, holding her niece adoringly. "And she has the Sullivan family nose." Mrs. Peterson appeared next, carrying flowers and unable to hold back her tears at the sight of the baby. The Hayes mansion will come alive again with the sound of children's laughter. Eleanor Hayes was the last to arrive, carrying a small gold locket. "It's tradition in the Hayes family," she explained, handing the jewel to Emma. "Each firstborn receives one on the day of their birth." Emma watched as Alexander took Charlotte in his arms, his expression a mixture of love and admiration. He began to softly sing an old lullaby, the same one his mother used to sing to him. "I knew you'd be a wonderful father," Emma smiled, feeling exhausted but completely happy. "And you're the most incredible mother our daughter could ever have," he replied, taking a seat on the edge of the bed. "Thank you for giving me this family, for trusting me, for loving me even with all my imperfections." Charlotte yawned at his arms, her small hands waving in the air. It was as if she too wanted to take part in this moment of love and gratitude. While the snow continued to fall outside, inside that hospital room, a new family was celebrating its beginning. The Hayes mansion, which had once been a symbol of loss and loneliness, was now waiting to be filled with Charlotte's love and laughter. Emma knew that the road there hadn't been easy or conventional, but every moment, from the hidden tears with the positive pregnancy test to the fire that changed everything, had led them to this perfect moment. And as she watched Alexander nursing their daughter, Emma understood that sometimes the greatest miracles come from the most unexpected situations. That true love knows no boundaries of social class or circumstance, and that some stories, even if they begin with fear and uncertainty, can end with the purest and most complete happiness.